Well, if coming back after lunch is a difficult slot, certainly coming back after the coffee break seems to have thinned everyone out a little bit. When I did my PhD, I was told that the most difficult thing to do is to write the body, and the easiest thing to do was to change your title. I kind of realised when I was playing with my PowerPoint slides on Friday that I changed the title to what we are doing today. But don't let that put you off. The content will be the same. So just before I begin, really, I just want you to spend a second or two and just think about the worst thing that's ever happened to you in your life. And then I'd like you to think about coming up here and sharing that with us, a room full of strangers, and think about how that might make you feel, whether it would be uncomfortable. You might be a bit embarrassed, perhaps sad, maybe very scared. Yet that's exactly what happens when we ask potential students to explain their previous criminal history when they apply through UCAS or directly to institutions for a place in higher education. Hearing someone's previous conviction can sound cold and uncompromising and make us all feel worried. And whilst I'm not certainly going to stand here and try and trivialise criminal actions, it's not that I'm not going to try and take into account the effect it has on victims. I am saying that when a conviction occurs, it can be very nuanced, it can be very individual, contextual, and the current system of declaring that does not take this into account. So today, unfortunately, with time constraints, I'm going to very briefly discuss three issues and try and look at why an equality of outcomes that's already been alluded to today, as opposed to an equality of opportunity, is important. Firstly, a health warning. This is a work in progress, and there is very little research within the UK into this area, particularly in relation to higher education institutions. But however, many of my suppositions are based on a very wide study that was carried out in America. So, HE environments are inherently safe places. But really, should they be cocooned from the realities of real life, the real world, where crime, unfortunately, does occur sometimes? Having to make a declaration at the start of an academic journey can cause students, potential students, to self-select and deselect themselves from the process. And the reason for that is they just can't go through this again. They just cannot explain to another bunch of people they don't know what it was they did. Institutions themselves are not the probation service or Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service. And they are not, with the best will in the world, equipped to deal and make the complex decisions about someone's future over supposed risk that they pose while studying, which often turns into a very moral judgment rather than a fully qualified management of that risk. The study in America ultimately showed that there's very little correlation between people with convictions and being safe within the campus. Now, I realise that that may be a lot to take in. So I'm going to look at some of the reasons that we want to remove these boxes. We've already seen this slide today. You'll notice my characters are actually slightly different. Unfortunately, many people from black and ethnic minorities may actually see that the reality is this. Now, most criminologists that I know would say that one of the ways of reducing crime broadly is that you actually educate and you employ people. Okay? And you can only do that perhaps in a higher education if you're prepared to let people in to start with. And this is particularly important for those who come from the BME, black and minority ethnic groups. John Rawls talks, amongst other things, about the fact that a meritocracy is not enough. We may not be able to change our initial start in life and where we're from, but it is inherent on institutions to be able to make sure that everyone has this best chance of opportunity, of outcomes, rather than just an opportunity to get to university. And this may mean, or may seem to be, unfair from the privileged who don't see that this is necessary in order to give everyone a fair chance. Now, this presentation isn't designed to discuss crime from any particular criminological perspective, but to consider how the outcomes affect those who want to apply for higher education. Now, I'm not talking about courses like nursing, I'm not talking courses like social work, which do require a full disclosure on your criminal activity, supposedly to protect children and vulnerable adults. We could have a whole conference while we discuss whether that works. It doesn't. But I want to discuss the current process for the selection into higher education institutions, for dealing with students who have and declare criminal convictions, and the fact that this particularly discriminates against people from black and ethnic minorities. So for the sake of clarity, I should explain that a student, when they apply to a higher education institution or to UCAS, through UCAS, the first thing they are met with is a box at the very start of the process asking them to tell whether they have any particular criminal convictions. These are ones that are deemed not to be spent. By spent, I mean that a certain time limit hasn't actually elapsed between the conviction. Certain convictions and for certain jobs are never spent. But I don't really want to waste too much time explaining that. Effectively, if your crime is unspent, you have to declare it. We could, but unfortunately time doesn't allow, we could discuss the fact that the UK has some of the longest rehabilitation periods, certainly in Europe, if not almost in the world. And this has an enormous effect on allowing somebody to move on with their life once they've served their sentence. This is post-serving your sentence. I could give you case study after case study of how this has impacted on people's lives. But the first point I want to look at is really linking widening participation and members of BME who are disproportionately represented generally throughout the criminal justice system. Many of these will not become as particular surprises to you. But if you are a member of that community, you're far more likely to be stopped and searched, you're far more likely to be arrested, you're far more likely, if you are convicted, to get a custodial sentence, and that sentence is likely to be longer. This isn't me making this up, this is the Ministry of Justice. I didn't put on the final little infogram of that, which actually showed the makeup of the people who actually work within that, which won't come as a big shock for you to know that predominantly it's white people. So, as I said, whilst in the UK, research into the effectiveness of declaring a criminal record in order to promote increased safety doesn't yet exist. I am working on it. It's very complex and seems to be taking a long time. But there has been extensive research carried out in the US. They surveyed a huge amount of institutions. Not least of all because a rather large amount of the population in America currently have criminal convictions. So what were their findings? Well, one of the most interesting key finding I found was that quite a sizable majority of the campuses they looked at, nearly 40%, don't actually gather that information. They don't care about your criminal past. And what they found was, compared to other institutions that do, is that there was no discernible difference in the safety of the students. They found that the collection of this data was problematic for a number of reasons. Most importantly, because there was no link established between the collection of this data and an increased risk to the student population. It doesn't make us any safer. As I said, criminal records are now very commonplace in the US. They're becoming more commonplace in the UK. And they suggest that accepting students with criminal records actually could promote wider public safety. As I said earlier, if you educate and you employ people, very often you reduce their ability or their willingness to be involved in crime. And you develop critical thinking skills. Likewise, for removal of institutional bias on applications, we should consider banning the box from the initial process, even if it's too much for many institutions to take on board the fact that gathering this data is not making your students any safer. This is actually more a moral judgment. This is actually more about institutional reputation. You're just not the kind of people we want at our institution studying with us. Then what we found is if you put this information at the back and you don't collect it until after you've considered the student as a whole, and you don't consider it until after you've made a place, then you are likely to remove institutional bias. Why is ban the box important, or does it work? In America, again, where they've looked at this, one of the city-states councils removed the box until after a job application had been offered, and they found that their employment of those with previous convictions went from something like 4% to 57%. Okay? Institutions also have a great deal of bias if they find out about somebody's conviction that hasn't made that initial declaration. One of the reasons that people deny telling is for the reasons I alluded before. People find it embarrassing, difficult, it's uncomfortable. They don't want to tell people. And people who often make these moral judgments sitting in their ivory towers within HR or other places within institutions won't understand that because they won't have been able to put themselves in that position. So as I said, the main report recommendation was that the use of criminal records should be scrapped completely. It achieved no aim. But I do appreciate that that is too much for many institutions here to actually take on board. But if we do actually want to try and widen participation to all groups of students, and particularly those from BME who are likely to come into criminal justice system and likely to have a negative dealings within the criminal justice system, they are overrepresented. There's clear evidence of that. There is this danger of deselection. Then at the very least, we should consider putting our box to the very end of the process once a decision has been made. One of the things I'm very pleased to say is that here at the London School of Business and Management, we are in the very process of doing that. We're putting our box and the information supplied by UCAS on criminal convictions to the very back of the process until after the process has actually been, the student has actually been offered a job. I think we've still a long way to go. As I said, HE institutions are not the probation service. They are ill-equipped to make these very, very nuanced and difficult decisions that require a lot of training. However, it's a very start to get these things moved to the back of the process, and hopefully that may remove any institutional bias before we start. So, who would actually like to be first to come up here and just discuss the worst thing that's ever happened to them? No one? Okay, thank you. Are there any questions on this?